Hello and welcome. In this episode of the podcast, we have a guest castaway, Mr. Miles Adcock, who is the CEO of Concurrent Technologies plc. Concurrent is a British company that designs and manufactures bespoke single-board computers. These are critical components of embedded systems that are used in the fields of defence, scientific research, security, telecommunications, aerospace and transportation. Mark holds shares in Concurrent, so Miles has kindly come to the island to tell him about some new developments and to talk with our other special guest, investment consultant Jeremy McKeown. Miles arrived courtesy of the Royal Navy. Jeremy swam here because, well, swimming is his thing. Anyway, I'm going to leave them to it, so I hope you enjoy their discussion in this, episode 22 of the Desert Island Investor. This episode of the podcast is generously hosted by Progressive Equity Research. Visit their website at progressive-research.com.
Miles, all three of us met and chatted in the past. It was about 18 months ago when you were 18 months into your appointment. But for those unfamiliar with Concurrent Technologies, could you just give us a brief outline?
Yeah, we're a business that's nearly 4 decades experienced in designing and manufacturing in our own factory in Colchester really advanced computer systems. So we make computer boards, but also the more complex systems they plug into, thanks to the acquisition we made last year, for really demanding markets, demanding of both performance, but also environmental robustness, dominated by the defence sector, but also into comms, medical and industrial.
Right. Well, upon your appointment and since, you've been very bold in your ambitions and have been detailed in what you wish to achieve, growing the business, increasing the product stream, flipping the order intake from 80% end of life to 80% new product, entering the systems market and being acquisitive. Now, all these things you've promised and delivered, and I'm sure there's much more internally that we've not had visibility of. Now, we're presenting you with the opportunity to admit a failing. You're 3 years into the role. Is there anything that you'd have liked to have done at this stage that you haven't?
You are right. We have done an awful lot. In fact, I was reflecting earlier that almost 3/4 of my colleagues started after I did. So arguably a completely transformed business in that time. Any regrets? Well, certainly some lessons learned, and a lesson that is worth learning several times is not to procrastinate on difficult people decisions, and perhaps not quite a regret, but I reflect that I could have moved a little faster on 1 or 2 key people issues.
Yeah, I think since we last spoke, Miles, I would say the highlight that I would recall is that you've delivered on your acquisition to make the company acquisitive, and you've delivered on the first acquisition in the US. So you've expanded geography, but you've also expanded in that process of making that acquisition, the product spread of the business. Can you just update us on how that's going? Presumably you're spending a lot more time in the US since this acquisition.
Yeah, so if we've got nearly 4 decades experience making computer boards, and I literally mean a printed circuit board with a computer on it, the acquisition of Philips Aerospace in Los Angeles gave us the ability to offer the next level up in the architecture, which is the rather complicated box, the chassis that these boards plug into. Really important that's based in the US. The US is by far the biggest market, and unlike standard product boards, which we can sell from the UK comfortably into the United States, if you want to do these systems in the US, you need to have an American footprint. You've got to have the credentials and track record and nationality to enable you to have really quite sensitive discussions with customers as they share with you the details of what they're trying to achieve in this rather sensitive market. So we bought Philips on the 6th of September last year, a small, long-term business with all of those credentials, bought it really as a capability buy. We didn't buy them for their financial performance. They were running at about $2 million a year, so really quite small. But it is the catalyst from which we can now create a fast-growing systems business, which has the potential, in broad terms, to be just as big as our boards business. Noting we did £31.7 million of revenue in that boards business last year, which was itself 73% up on the prior year. That is going very well. The people are very happy. We give them investment and security that they didn't have before. Just a few weeks ago, we announced 2 key contract wins into that business for what I'll call concurrent systems, i.e. the nature of work that we've been building a pipeline for, which is a little different to the work that Philips historically did. So we're starting to win now. And what I've said publicly is during the course of this year, it's our aspiration to make a handful of announcements for several $100,000 each wins, which builds momentum against which we can start to recruit. We've already recruited a handful of key roles in addition to the team that they're already. As we build that business, what I won't do is seek to win the, say, $10 million order that risks breaking that organization. So we'll grow stepwise. It's going really well. I just got back from a week in Washington, D.C., where I had meetings with key customers who are really enthused about what we're doing with this acquisition and are very keen to work with us so that we provide them with the boxes, the systems that they're looking for, which can also, of course, include our boards products. So by having acquired Philips, we do create market for our legacy business too. It's going very well.
And this makes you front into the US as an American business, as a US company into the defense supply chain.
It absolutely does. So we go from being a sales organization with some technical support as a satellite office to the UK, now as a fully rooted American business with all the credentials and infrastructure that comes with, albeit small today, but absolutely growing.
So with these customers that you've been engaging with and winning contracts for, would they be recognizable names? Would they be tier one defense contractors, or you some way down the chain from the prime contractors?
No, it's a mixture of tier one defense contractors that you've absolutely heard of.
Yeah.
And newer, ambitious, early in their journey companies who are looking to partner with organizations with similar ambition. They have lots of potential. So a mixture of the two, but certainly companies you will have heard of will be in the mix.
Okay. And overall, the move into the systems side of the business, this is the first step. Does it will it require further investment to scale, or is this sufficient to get you to the ambition of making it a similar size business to the boards business?
It does need investment, but the cash dynamics in the systems business are different. So typically it's project work where customers will pay upfront mobilization and will pay on a milestone-based business. So that means you can generally, in a recruiting sense, you can recruit in line with the business growing. We will be investing in a new facility. The facility we're currently in is not fit for the purpose that we have in mind going forwards. So if that goes well, later this year we'll invest. We've got a planning assumption of £1 million in a new facility. But beyond that, yes, this business is the catalyst that can take us to our ambition. That said, today we do single board computers, these computer boards, the chassis it goes into, everything else that goes into a system we get from either supply chain or partnership. Our acquisition strategy is clear, and it's to occupy increased amounts of content inside of that box. So when the time is right, we will come back to do another acquisition.
Okay. But as far as the acquisition you've made and your footprint you have in the States, it sounds like there's a solid sort of organic, relatively small scale investment opportunity to invest ahead of organic growth rather than having to make a quantum step.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. A stepwise investment in line with the business growing.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
Right. Well, cards on the table from me. I've been a shareholder in Concurrent since July 2017 when I paid 81 pence. And I've made successive additions at 67, 89, 79, 72, 79. And most recently, the highest I've paid is £1.05 on the release of the final results. Now, I generally refrain from asking directors about share prices because they cannot directly control them and they're at the mercy of the markets. But given the delayed 2022 results that went to the very last day possible before the shares would have been suspended and the auditors required more time, I think there was a feeling in the market of, there must be no smoke without fire, and this depressed the share price. It had been in the low 70s. It dropped to around 55 pence when the results were released. And then on the 30th, they were released on the 30th June. And then there was a strong bounce a couple of weeks later on the release of a positive trading update to around 70 pence. So some people might look at the current share price and think it's nearly doubled in the last year and think it's had its run. So Jeremy and I had a chat about this and he described it as price anchoring. So my question is, do you think that the current share price is still suffering from that really something of a false low?
So I'm not a pundit, but I would like to think so, and I'll give a few reasons. So we are winning like we've never won before. These things I call major design wins. So these are where we get designed in, we get built in, and we know that we will enjoy the revenues from that work as our customers hit their main production programs, maybe 2 or 3 years later. And we declared that the 8 major design wins that we secured last year have a conservative lifetime value of £100 million. That's a real step change for this business. On the assumption that we can do that, or at least that year on year, then you quite quickly get to a point where you realise the business is on a pretty steep growth trajectory. So point one. Point two, the small cap market has been depressed from net outflows for the best part of 3 years. And our liquidity is quite low, which probably doesn't help either. So, we tend not to see built into the share price the talent in the business and the pipeline of opportunity that we see growing. So as we execute on that, I would hope to see quite a lot of growth still in the share price from where it is today.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think that period that Mark talked about, Miles, when there was I wouldn't say dispute, there seemed to be there was a delay that was ironed out in the uncertainty around the production of your results, which led to quite a remarkable hiatus in the share price that has that I think was unfortunate. But as you described, the illiquidity of smaller companies over the last few years, which I think became exacerbated around that same time, really conspired against you. That in a way that I think has been unfortunate.
Yes, it was an extremely difficult audit. We'll note that we've changed audit partners since then.
I've seen that, yes.
And this year's audit went extremely well and was finished in about half the time of the prior year's audit. So anything we may have been concerned around that time, from my perspective, is consigned to history, and we now have a good first year with our new audit partner.
Great.
Miles, you mentioned these 8 new products that we've brought to the market. Now, you've explained previously that the revenues will not kick in for several years, but you've said that they've got an anticipated lifetime value of around £100 million. So can you give some idea of what's the lifetime of these products? Over what period of time can we expect this 100 million revenue?
Yeah, absolutely. And a subtlety here is that's not 8 new products. That's 8 major design wins. So this is programs of record with customers who we have a very strong expectation will now buy product from us year on year on year to support their very specific program. We have that confidence because in all cases, these are American defense programs called programs of record, where it's publicly stated that the DoD intends to, for example, upgrade a vehicle. And we're working with the prime contractor who's been down selected to do that upgrade. And we know from them they've chosen our product to be part of their overall solution. So we can have that confidence. The £100 million then is a conservative view based on what we understand to be the lower end of the window defined by how many, say, vehicles, worst case, best case, we expect the DoD to want to upgrade, which is why it's conservative. 7 to 10 years, typical life cycle.
Okay.
So take that 100 million, assume it doesn't really start to kick in until perhaps 2026, and then spread that out across at least 7 years, and that's pretty much what it'll look like.
And is it risk adjusted to the probability that I don't know what the probability is of 8 new design wins might lead to 7.5 products or 7.5 contracts or 6.5 contracts or whatever that probability adjustment is?
So the answer to your question is yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Presumably, we'll have, if we can do the same again, we'll get this kind of layering effect looking forward.
Absolutely. So last year we pursued 20 of these major design wins. We won 8. In fact, there's another 4 where we were down selected by our customer, but our customer has not yet won the competition they're in. So there's the possibility of further upside should those 4 customers win their competitions. But yeah, the intent is to layer year on year. This year we're pursuing rather more than 20. So let's see how well we do. But with a conversion rate of roughly half last year, we should have a degree of optimism for the performance we'll achieve this year.
You've stated that we intend to be acquisitive, and several shareholders and potential investors have shared their concerns about their holdings being potentially diluted by a future fundraise. And it was a question that arose a couple of times during the IMC presentation following the final results. So can you understand those concerns, and what can you say to reassure the many private investors? And is there any particular reason why we'd favour a fundraising rather than take on debt, which, given the strong cash generation of the business, we might be able to pay off in short order?
There's a few points to make there. So I would observe that at our low point last year, cash was around £3 million, which, without doing the fundraise, would have delayed by at least 6 months, maybe a year, our ability to really move forward with the acquisition of Philips and the other investments we wanted to make around that. We're not interested at debt in this point in time. We are exploring debt facilities. We don't have one at present. But in any case, they don't yield the quanta that we might be looking for any future acquisitions. The Philips acquisition was extremely small, a good pipe cleaner for us in terms of process, but our ambition is somewhat higher than that going forward. It's our job to present a business case to investors whereby they don't feel like their investment is being diluted. And with a share price at the point of equity raise of 63p, I would hope that investors feel like the rather modest number of shares we raised at that time hasn't diluted their investment. And in fact, perhaps it's going quite well at the moment. So in the future, when we're acquisitive, we have the view that the point of being in the AIM market for us is to be able to give investors the opportunity to put money into the business. And we will exercise that with business cases which are hopefully so compelling that people will see they'll get growth in their holding, not dilution.
That's an interesting segue onto what I wanted to ask you about, which is trying to get a feel for the scale of your ultimate M&A ambition. I like the term you used there, that Philips was your pipe cleaner. So how big is your pipe, I guess is the question. Would you like to explore new geographies or new products? I guess both. Where are we? Obviously we have to be careful discussing this subject, but can we get some view from you about the scale of your ambition and what the next step or couple of steps might be?
Yes. In terms of scale of ambition, with the business we have today, so prior to any further acquisition, I've said several times that £100 million will be a meaningful waypoint for our journey. I truly believe this business, as it is today, has the ability to grow to £100 million. Good waypoint. In terms of ambition for acquisition, no particular desire to get into a new geography in the short to medium term. Oversight of a jurisdiction in addition to the UK and the US is an overhead that we're not looking for at the moment. But you never know. If the right thing came up, then maybe. We really need to develop more critical mass. So anything we do buy will absolutely build more of our percentile content on these systems that we're selling to customers. If we're going to do that, it suggests buying a boards business that does storage or floating point, field programmable gate arrays or graphics cards or switches or the various other things that are boards in systems. Any business that is doing a good enough job of that to be interesting enough to buy is likely to be at least many tens of people, many single-digit, perhaps double-digit millions of pounds per annum, and therefore will look not dissimilar to how Concurrent Technologies looked 3+ years ago. I think that's a likely scenario. Now, the one thing you can't do is predict what actually turns out in the world of M&A. So what I've described is an ideal scenario rather than necessarily a hard plan.
And can you give us some help on understanding how you're professionalizing and your approach, how you're building your approach to finding these opportunities? Because as you say, they don't just fall off the tree. You have to go and build relationships and understand cultures and opportunities and essentially wait for the right opportunity to become available.
Yeah, you do. The Philips acquisition, we shook hands on that 15 months before the transaction actually happened. And that's a really good example of having worked with a business to, by nature of working together, get the insight you need on culture, processes, fit, etc. So again, the ideal path would be to move forward with businesses that we've already developed a relationship with. This business has relationships with many, many more businesses and partners than it would have done 3 years ago. So plan A is that we mature a relationship through current and future relationships that we create. Plan B then is being a little more speculative around understanding companies that we don't yet work with. I'm clearly expressing a preference for path A, but let's see.
And how much of your time, I'm sure you don't disaggregate it completely, but how much would you think you spend of your time working in this area specifically to develop those type of relationships?
Very good question. I'm outside of the business probably 50% of the time with stakeholders, whether they're partners, customers, or indeed investors.
Yeah.
And of that time, probably a third of that time is with partner organizations.
Okay.
So a sixth of my time-ish is spent nurturing these relationships.
So since we last spoke, Miles, you were in the middle of the semiconductor and other sort of supply chain constraints that has subsequently largely or to a significant extent unwound. But the semiconductor market, which is clearly critical to the development and the growth of your business and what's going on in your in your business on a day-to-day basis continues to change rapidly. That hasn't changed. What are the implications for you and the business? And particularly, I'm thinking of the way AI has come to seemingly dominate everything you read about semiconductors, and the way AI is dominating the supply chain for semiconductors, the value in the semiconductor industry, this huge wave of sort of the tsunami of spending that we're told is happening in the data center area. Has that got sort of implications, I guess, indirectly in terms of causing you issues with your semiconductor suppliers, or indeed the growth of AI? Is that changing the requirements that's put upon you from your customers, or is that too early?
AI is clearly part of the zeitgeist at the moment, but has of course been around for a very long time. We're not today seeing any direct demand from our customers for anything that you might consider to be an AI product, noting we're primarily hardware.
Yep.
So it's not today changing our business or the demand on the business. I'm sure there will be ways in which it does change the business in the future. In terms of supply chain, no, we're not finding things are any harder to get hold of. It's worth noting that the semiconductor industry, after a boom of demand during the global lockdown, did see quite a slump in commercial demand, which is part of what accelerated the semiconductor foundry's ability to fulfill the needs again, because generally less demand on them. So we're enjoying pretty good lead times for parts that we're ordering at the moment. So that's a very roundabout way of saying at the moment it's business as usual, despite clearly an understandable amount of public attention on AI. We did about 4 or 5 years ago, so before I joined the company, launch an artificially intelligent focused product. We sold literally zero of that product at that time. So it's quite a long time ago. We sold literally zero of that. It was one of the first things I did was impair investment that we'd made in that product.
Oh, okay, interesting. And in this, the changes going on among the semiconductor industry, Intel, who are your principal supplier, have not exactly they've not become one of the Magnificent Seven, which maybe is a good thing, maybe not. But are there any changes that have come about in the last 18 months? Any changes in terms of the relationship with Intel, or is the core of the business still to be concurrent with Intel product launches?
The relationship with Intel is extremely strong.
Yeah.
And I met a number of their very senior leaders as part of Intel's conference that was hosted for Europe in London just a few weeks ago. Intel are dominant in defense for high-power computer systems. So the sorts of things we do, really Intel are the only provider of processor technologies. Of course, NVIDIA are doing extremely well for graphics processing units, which is not what we do, although graphics processor cards do exist in the systems that we aspire to sell. So we've got good eyes on what's happening with NVIDIA-based solutions, but Intel are exceptionally important to us. You won't find many instances of AMD processors, if any, really, in defense. And you will sometimes find ARM processors in defense, and we've learned how to do ARM, but they tend to be for a very different use case, much lower size, weight, and power, rather than the really intense high-power computing that we do.
Okay.
Right. At last year's AGM, resolutions 1 to 8 were passed by the requisite majority, whilst resolutions 9 and 10, which related to the disapplication of preemption rights and the company's ability to purchase its own shares, were withdrawn. Now, the board stated it would consider further engagement with shareholders on this matter. Now, they've not reappeared as resolutions on this year's AGM. So can you provide any backstory, Miles, please, on why these resolutions were withdrawn?
Yes, it was as simple as, at that time, not enough of our institutional holders had voted, and therefore we could see that we weren't going to get the number of votes needed to pass that resolution. That resolution being all about the company's ability to issue stock up to a particular threshold, to create a degree of nimbleness and flexibility around generating equity should there be a short-term demand to do so. That's the backstory.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, about AGMs, they have varying levels of attendance, and ours is later this week. And you like to engage with shareholders and potential investors, and you've agreed to this chat with us today. I'd just like to ask how well attended is the Concurrent AGM? And this used to be held at Colchester, but has been conducted at Thiel over the last few years. And I would just like to ask a second question. Is this down to it being more centrally located, or is it just does it have better facilities at Thiel for this event?
Thiel is better located for many people travelling. That's the only reason we hold it there. All of our facilities are entirely adequate for hosting people. Last year, we had 2 investors arrive for the AGM. The year before, I think it was maybe 6. So attendance is not high. But nonetheless, myself and the chair are absolutely present. And if we get 2, 6 or 60 this week, we will share as much as we possibly can with those people good enough to spend their time with us.
Are you going, Mark?
I'm not going, unfortunately. I've spent quite a bit of time away from home, and I have to spend some time under my own roof. But I would just say to people that one of the advantages of if there are very few people at an AGM is that you get a lot of time to ask everything that you want to ask. That's the experience of that. You've got a bit of a captive audience. So, I would encourage people who are thinking of going to certainly attend. Just moving on a little bit, I think it's fair to say, I don't want to put words into Jeremy's mouth, but that we're both ESG skeptics. Now, on one hand, I'm told by certain companies how important ESG is to shareholders, but this isn't the message that I receive when I speak to shareholders directly, which is every day. Now, in the annual report, our ESG report is just 1 page, and I find this quite reassuring. So when it comes to what we're doing on ESG, and you immediately point to our employees, and you tellingly call this our talent. So I was just thinking, Miles, what's your views on ESG, and what feedback do you receive from shareholders and potential investors?
On ESG, this is just a fact. I might get asked 1 or 2 questions a year explicitly on ESG. So thus far in my journey here, it hasn't been at the top, it would seem, of investors' minds in their discussions with us. ESG is very important. It's very important where it makes a difference to business performance. We've just been through a profound transformation, which I don't think could have been done any quicker or with more intensity. Therefore, the business priority during that period has absolutely been our talent and our people, and motivating them, supporting them, taking them through change. Anything that distracts from that in that past 3 years just adds risk to the business. Therefore, I'm absolutely not in any way apologetic for having been extremely focused on doing the activities that support people. If some of those activities fall under the framework of ESG, well then great. That's a way in which we can articulate what we've done inside of this business. So, short version for me is I'm not an ESG cynic. A lot of what the ESG agenda is trying to do is very important, but it must be linked to what we've actually done, and it must be motivated by actually improving the business.
So just following on from that focus you've had on your talent, your people talent, the last time we spoke, you were in the middle of a huge hiring spree. I think you'd already replaced or were in the process of not replacing, but I think 40% of your staff when we last spoke were new to the business. You talked about a significant number of your staff not having this is how we've always done it view of the way Concurrent operates. So there's a sort of question mark over the culture of the business. You've already said just now that 75, I think I'm right, you said 75% of the people in the business today have joined after you, which is some 3 years ago. So this is a very, as you just pointed out, an incredible people transformation exercise. Is this ongoing? Is it slowing down? You're clearly you have ambition to grow. So I guess the hiring spree continues. And I think that does beg all kinds of questions around managing that pace and managing and developing or understanding the culture that comes from this phenomenon.
Yeah, we've passed the peak of recruiting for now. Absolutely. So what we've said is our board's business, the business that Concurrent Technologies has always been, has enough of the right resources now to deliver £40 million a year. So you won't see the cost base of that business grow meaningfully until we pass that threshold, and then there might be a little bit of a step up at that time. Yes, we're investing in the systems business, headcount-wise, but apart from 2 or 3 necessary overhead roles, for example, we just hired a financial controller in LA, most of the demand for people is in line with work that we're winning, and therefore is to some extent self-funding. So actually we passed that period. Now the culture, we've quite forensically defined a target culture, and we've used a third party to help us with that, where the tenets of that target culture are get things done, no spectators, buzzing and ambition. And beneath those are observable behaviours that indicate how well progressed along towards that target we are. And we ask our colleagues to answer a number of questions every 6 months, which for every team, so every manager in the business, gets to understand how well progressed they are since 6 months ago towards quite a metricated, defined, specific target culture. Now, I'm labouring that a little because a lot of people think culture is a soft and fluffy thing that just kind of goes in the right direction if you're nice to each other. Actually, culture has a very hard edge and can be quite scientifically driven, albeit in the end, it is all about human interaction.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think, that's an interesting perspective. So, in terms of the growth path of the business, the core board's business, where are we in terms of overall manufacturing capacity? I think when we last spoke, you're clearly looking to grow capacity by introducing more shifts. Where are we running at the moment? And in the UK, where are we on the filling the capacity in Colchester and Thiel?
Yep. So the factory is in Colchester.
Yep.
And so when we talk about capacity, we mostly are thinking about the factory. We have a full second shift implemented. That was implemented for the second half of last year. So that broadly has the ability to deliver that £40 million per annum. As we get up to that level of revenue through that business, we have a decision to make, and we're going through the planning for that now. And the decision is, do we implement an additional line, which would give us roughly another 50% capacity? Or do we use third-party manufacturers, or is it a combination of the two? There's pros and cons for all of those. It's entirely normal to use third-party manufacturers. Some of our competitors don't have their own internal capacity at all for production. We find it to be a strategic asset. Having operations and engineering work together on product development and product launch is very good. So we absolutely wouldn't reduce our internal capacity. It's also true that the premises we have for the factory in Colchester, the lease is up for renewal in 2026, and we're at capacity. We literally don't have enough toilets or car parking spaces to fit any other human beings in the building. So we either move lock, stock and barrel to a bigger facility, or I take out the engineering or office-based people and find a facility nearby. Pros and cons to both of those as well. So we're in the thick of all the decision-making about generating more capacity. What we won't do is wait until we experience the demand to last minute decide how we create more capacity.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Thank you.
The progress that we've made, Miles, is against the backdrop of the component shortage now, and that's largely behind us. So have we reverted back to old practices, or have we maintained a kind of just in case mindset?
That's a really interesting question. So roughly 80% of the management of this business joined after I did. That means 80% of us have never experienced normal, because we joined in the aftermath of the COVID epidemic, and then headlong into component shortages globally. So we have little concept of normal. We did introduce an awful lot of rigor during that period. In some ways, it was quite useful. Useful in terms of it forced us to meticulously understand the nuts and bolts in detail of how the factory worked and how other people's products delivered to us are then managed and turned into our products. So we have a forensic understanding of the factory, which didn't exist at all before, ever. So that's proven very useful. There's clearly practices that we want to keep, but as we enter this, let's say, normal period, there's also a degree of overhead and scrutiny and reporting which we can relax on. We are, again, in the thick of understanding what is the right optimization to maintain efficiency, but not revert to any prior bad practices that might have existed, albeit many of us weren't here to have experienced them.
Okay, well, we've reinstated a dividend of 1p, subject to this being passed. Now, I've gone back 20 years, back to 2004, when the dividend was just 0.5p, and it was 1p back in 2006. Now, the dividend accreted gradually every year until 2020, when it reached 2.55p. So there are many different types of investors, and some are dividend driven. And have you formulated any kind of dividend policy?
The dividend policy we stated previously was that dividends would be paid out of in-year profit and cash, which is why there was no dividend at all for FY22. Now, the big difference in the business today versus the vast majority of that period you're referring to is that we're committed to growth, and that growth takes investment. So we've clearly positioned to maintain a dividend, and it is at a different quanta relative to the size of the business that was perhaps normal in the past. I've just come off the back of a 5-week roadshow with investors, and one of the things I've asked investors is, what's the opinion on dividend? Absolutely extreme views, as you might expect, views to either end of the spectrum. My sense is that the prevailing view is a sense of comfort that a dividend is reinstated, but that we're generating more headroom to manage our own investment rather than, there were years where pretty much all of the company's profit was going into dividend, which I would say probably substantially limits the business's ability to invest in growth. So, long answer, let's see what happens going forward. What I have said is not in our interest to spring surprises on investors one way or the other. So don't expect any dramatic moves.
I don't have the history that Mark has with Concurrent. And in fact, I only became aware of Concurrent when Mark told me about you and what you were doing in the business a few months or a few weeks probably before we recorded the last podcast. But my understanding is that, shall we say, previous iterations of management and ownership of Concurrent were more, I don't know, want of a better word, a lifestyle type business than having a specific growth strategy that would be attractive to external capital. So I think one has to bear in mind the sort of structural changes that have occurred here, rather than just the changing market and financial market backdrops, I guess.
Yeah, and I get the same feedback. And there are a number of institutional holders who strongly have the view that we should have zero dividend.
I can see that entirely. But I think, sorry to cut across, but I think also that you make the point, and I think I would imagine a number of institutional investors would have made that point to you as well, that having that token, if maybe a bit more than a token, but an element of dividend payment, just gives a sense of reality to the cash flow the business is generating.
Yeah, I totally agree. Hence what we've proposed this year.
Yeah, interesting.
Well, our emphasis on the defence sector has risen from an already high 73% to 85% of revenue. Now, given the critical nature, this is an area where products need to be made up to a quality and not down to a price. So, can you share any details as to the margins and how these compare with other sectors in which we operate, be that industrial, scientific, medical, or communications?
Margins are broadly similar. The key to defence is getting product to market very quickly, because as they go through the evaluation process of down selecting computing for their new vehicle or their upgraded aircraft or whatever it is, they know they're going to spend the next 7 or 10 years implementing that solution, which means 10 years later, it's a 10 years old technology, hence their desire to have the very, very latest right up front. So defence, more than anybody, drives a desire for the very latest technology at the point they make that down select. Margins across industries are similar. A very appealing thing about the defence sector is it's pretty honourable, and you tend not to get practices of multi-sourcing and then cancelling all but one supplier. You tend not to see programs or opportunities get cancelled too often, and you tend not to get people reneging on their commitments. So it's quite good from that perspective. The variability is often timing, so you often get delays in defence programs. So whilst you might be confident in winning the work, the date that you win it can move quite dramatically sometimes. The growth in defence for us is less driven by growth in defence overall. I mean, there's a lot of talk in the UK, for example, about 2.5% of GDP. Well, it's 2.2%, I understand, of GDP today. So our movement in defence is much more about securing market share than anything to do with the macro environment. Most other sectors, most of the time, can get their computing needs with more commoditized, less expensive solutions. So whilst we maintain our margins in those other sectors, it's because we choose to only do what we choose to do rather than have a race to the bottom on commoditized hardware, which is not what we're about.
Yeah, that's just interesting that our percentages work when you mention that 2.5 and 2.2. It doesn't sound a lot, but our percentages work is that the difference to that the net is nearly 14%. So that's quite a big increase in spend.
Yes, of course. Yeah, but I said earlier that for this business as it is today, I view £100 million per annum as a meaningful waypoint. Our ambition significantly outstrips the macro trend in defence.
To that point, there's an interesting headline in the FT today about it says global defence groups hiring at fastest rate in decades amid record orders. So this is not just a UK phenomenon or even this is not a country specific or regional phenomenon. It must be the fastest growing of the markets you serve. Defence must have been the fastest growing category, and the as well as the largest one that you served at the time since you joined Concurrent, I would guess.
Yeah, that is true. Certainly, comms have seen a slowdown in their market.
Yes,
which is always our biggest customer community in the past. We've had a couple of one-off orders which you can't really attribute a trend. For example, medical. We got a very good contract for medical a couple of years ago.
Yeah,
doesn't really represent a trend, even though it's a step up for us.
Although you say comms has slowed down, one area of communication is that we talked about briefly last time we spoke that I think you've got some history with is satellite communications. And if there's an area that's almost as sexy as AI since during the period since we've been talking, it's probably satellite communications and the growth in space technology. Is there anything happening in that sector that is of interest, that may be of value to Concurrent going forward?
There may be in the future, you're right. And I've got a fair bit of experience working in the space sector. Our focus is defence at the moment because there is so much movement in defence that we're really quite focused on that.
Yeah.
To provide hardware into space, you need to have some capabilities we don't have. For example, radiation hardness. There's a lot of radiation in space. So we haven't necessarily protected our electronics from that. So there'd be investments to make to be able to sell things into space. And the products that we sell at the moment are mostly very targeted at defence, which comes with certain standards and architectural principles and capabilities which don't necessarily align to what space customers would want. And finally, size, weight and power is a huge driver in space, and has been, is less aligned perhaps to some of our products at the moment. So, sorry, long answer. There is opportunity in space, but we'll address it later rather than now.
Okay, makes sense.
To an extent, it is Concurrent a Goldilocks defence business. I mean, it benefits from the increasing defence spend, but its products are far enough removed from the sharp end. We're not manufacturing torpedoes or missiles, and this is unlikely to deter investors with certain sensitivities.
You could take that view. I'm pausing because of the influence on certain sensitivities. Clearly, I'm a professional that's worked in the defence sector for more than a quarter of a decade, and I think it is an incredibly important sector for ultimately the well-being of our society. So I'm a big supporter of what we do in defence, but you are absolutely right. What this company does is provide computing capability. We're not in the world of designing or manufacturing weapons.
So on that, are we prohibited from selling to any particular countries? And if we sold a product, could it be under the pretense that it's for a medical application, but it in truth have a military use?
That's extremely unlikely. So we're strongly regulated. In the UK and the US, we direct sell to customers, so we know exactly who we're selling to. In the rest of the world, we use distributors who have high reputation, high visibility. We're regulated strongly by the export environment in the UK. We almost always have an end user undertaking certificate, so we know exactly where our product goes. I guess it's hard to talk in the world of absolutes, but we've never experienced a problem, and we're pretty well governed both through government, quite rightly imposed protocols and audits, etc., and by nature of how we go about doing our business. To your question, are there countries we can't sell to? Absolutely. So the UK maintain and update a list of countries where you are allowed to do our kind of business with, and there are a number of countries there that we cannot and will not sell to. There are also, in addition to that, sometimes countries that we would choose not to sell to, more from a business risk or commercial interest perspective, rather than one of international security.
So when we last spoke, Miles, you shared your thoughts on being the being the CEO of a listed company for the first time, although you've had a long history of working in large privately held and listed companies before. Since we last spoke, you've had a few ups and downs, more ups than downs, but we talked about the period, the audit delay that impacted you last year, and then the acquisition, which you managed to raise equity for. So your listing has served a purpose as well. But over the course of the period, you've had ups and downs. How's your thinking about being a listed company evolved in this period? You mentioned the lack of liquidity to UK smaller companies, and something that I think feels to me we're past the low point on. What are your thoughts on this subject?
At a very personal level, I thoroughly enjoy it.
Okay, that's good.
I feel part of a community.
Yep.
I like being held to account by that community. Equally, I like the freedom that being a public company affords versus necessarily being held by a sole owner, for example. And I do make the observation that I wonder how many smaller companies are not progressively managed. So I do wonder how many other companies out there are have huge untapped potential by virtue of the leadership teams they happen to have. But in terms of being a public company, look, it's a great way to raise money. And repeating myself, I find it thoroughly enjoyable.
That's really good. And I guess as you described the acquisition, I love this phrase, the pipe cleaner that is Philips. That must have been a interesting learning process for how capital markets work, because I guess it's the first time as a leader of a business that you've raised fresh equity in a public market setting.
Yeah, exactly. Huge learning process. And despite being a small acquisition, of course, all of the hoops that you have to go through are still the same.
Absolutely, yeah.
So you do get all of that learning through a relatively small value raise. Yes. And no one writes it down. I mean, there was no place I could go to easily second guess the lessons that we would learn. You really do have to go through the process. Extremely useful.
Okay, interesting.
Well, as a private investor, when I look at defence, it seems a very consistent sector to be involved in. If we look at the human condition, it's often one of hostility towards one another. And we probably started by throwing stones, and then we fashioned a spear that could be used for hunting, but also doubled as a weapon. And sadly, a consistent backdrop has been one of conflict throughout history, through people wanting to seize territory for resources or impose their way of life on others, or just to deflect the pressure of domestic issues by turning on an external enemy. So, what some countries call defence is actually attack spending. And I thought I'd just turn this question round to Jeremy as a market commentator. And we're just a flawed species, Jeremy, and that we'll always seek defence spending. What's your thoughts?
I think I like to look at the world from my personal perspective. I like to look at the world from a more positive framework, I guess. But it's hard to disagree with your fundamental premise. I think what we're in today is coming off a period of several decades, 3-4 plus decades of declining defence spending in the West. And that's something that has been abruptly reversed in many countries since 2022 and the events of 2022. So, and I think it comes back to the questions that we talked about earlier around whether defence spending is consistent with an approach to running investments in an ESG framework. And something I recently talked with Nick Prest, who's the founder and chairman of the defence services and technology company Cohort. And he made the point that although pacifism is a perfectly acceptable philosophical point of view, it's not one that has been articulated or promoted by any mainstream political party in the UK's history. And therefore, to consider the activities around defence spending and the arming of a nation state to defend itself is somehow dirty or tainted in the way that perhaps, say, the tobacco industry is now regarded, is very questionable, to say the least. I don't know. But it's an interesting point. I don't know if you've got any views on that, Miles. I know we don't want to get into a political discussion. I'm sure you're keen to avoid that. But I just wondered what your thoughts are, having been spent a successful career in the defence industry.
Thank you. So personally, I think it's extremely important that countries have the ability to fundamentally defend themselves. And despite the horrendous things that are happening around the world at the moment, I think it's probably true that we've lived in the West through one of the most peaceful, prolonged periods of time in human history. And I'm sure that's significantly due to the defensive capability that our countries have. Ultimately, what human beings choose to do with that capability should always be under scrutiny.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that I would totally agree with that. I think I think I would go further and say anything that any government does should be under scrutiny or on behalf of its citizens, but particularly where it involves the ability to inflict violence on other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And whilst it might be attractive, I suspect that an entirely undefended capability in terms of military capability would experience pretty poor outcomes.
I think I'm right in saying, this is for the trivia minded, Costa Rica is the only country in the world that doesn't have a standing army or defence capability. But I might be wrong, but it's the only one I'm aware of. I think the history of Costa Rica is fascinating because it is such an outlier. But I think, unfortunately, it will remain an outlier. And for the rest of us, I think it is a necessary part of being in a functioning society.
Yes.
So the last time we spoke, the three of us spoke on on the podcast. You, Miles, talked about how you cope with your blindness. It was hugely revealing and inspiring. And I say that from a personal perspective, but I've had a huge amount of comments from people who listen to that episode and say how moved they were by your what you shared with us in that podcast. One of the things you said that I thought was really interesting in the way you thought about how you cope with the disability was that you didn't see any difference between home life and work life. You said it's just life. Now that's interesting in itself, but what do you do to switch off, and what coping mechanisms do you employ to manage the stresses and strains and the responsibilities for running a growing and successful PLC?
Thank you. So running a business is all about projecting your energy into other people. It's about trying to get other people, either in the business or stakeholders, to think and do different things. So it's demanding of energy. So I would answer that question by, I seek to prioritize the things that generate energy in me. And these are things that a lot of people by default put to the bottom of the list. So I strive to put at the top of the list exercise, time with family, things that generate well-being in me. When I started this job, I took up a regime of 4 or 5 times a week of pretty hard exercise. That's really important to me. I derive a lot of my own confidence and energy from being physically fit. And in turn, I think that makes me more energetic and effective as a leader. Of course, there are times where you do have to park all those things. But as a principle, prioritize sleep, exercise, and time with family. And I fundamentally believe you're more effective at work.
Do you do your best thinking during or after exercise, or does it come about randomly?
I don't know that I have an answer to that, but I do find that my energy levels are much more level during the day than before I started taking exercise seriously. So exercise and diet,
Yeah.
for me, give me access to longer periods of being reasonably coherent of thought.
Yeah. No, I just find that I agree entirely with your philosophy. I think that's very interesting. I just find that when I go to the gym or I go for a run, the stretching afterwards in the gym or the time in the shower afterwards, particularly if over the previous 24 hours, 48 hours, I'm wrestling with something I can't quite sort out in my head, after exercise, these things just fall into place. And I if I ever have light bulb moments, which are few and far between these days, it's after exercise.
I definitely see that. And I think there's another point in there, which is a lot of leaders and managers fall into the trap of thinking that their job is to be as busy as possible, filling their day up with stuff. and somebody recently said to me that the job of a CEO is to have 3 or 4 fantastic ideas or conclusions per annum.
Yes.
And actually, if you're going to do that, you need not to clutter your day up too much. So you definitely need space in which to have those brainwaves.
Fewer, higher quality decisions.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you.
Miles, I'd just like to say thank you. Thank you for the time that you've given us and helping to put the message across for the business. I'm certainly excited by the future. It's 18 months since we last spoke, and I'm sure if you give us the opportunity to speak in another 18 months, a lot will happen again. So thank you very much indeed.
We've got to get off this island yet. Sorry, Miles, I interrupted you.
I was just saying thank you both very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Well, that's all for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed it. Please remember the content is for information only and it is not financial advice. If you have a question for Mark for our Question in a Bottle podcast, just complete the form on our website, thedesertislandinvestor.co.uk. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.